Hi, I'm Hannah. This is Theology Therapist. Thanks for being here today. There are many pros or protective factors of religion. Some of those we have talked about in previous episodes. Today I want to shift gears and I want to talk to you about the cons or the risk factors of religion. So you hear me saying pro and con, but you also hear me saying protective factor and risk factor. What does that mean? What are those? So a protective factor is an aspect or an influence on someone's life that decreases the likelihood of mental illness, the development of mental illness, decreases the likelihood of the presence of crime, victimization, or fear of crime in a community. And it increases overall well-being. So that's a protective factor. Now, risk factor is really the opposite, right? So a risk factor increases the likelihood of the development of a mental illness, increases the likelihood of presence of crime, victimization, or fear of crime in a community, and it decreases overall well-being. I have a list here. I want to read you some examples of protective factors, and you're going to see it pop up on the screen. I want to give you some specific examples of what am I talking about when I'm talking about a pro, a protective factor. What does that mean? What that means of a protective factor is having positive attitudes, values, or beliefs, conflict resolution skills, good mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional health, positive self-esteem, success at school, good parenting skills, parental supervision, strong social supports, community engagement, problem-solving skills, positive adult role models, coaches or mentors, healthy prenatal and early childhood development, participation in traditional healing and cultural activities, good peer group or good friends, steady employment, stable housing, and availability of services. So social services, recreational, cultural, having access to those things. Now, what are examples of risk factors? So here we're just doing the opposite of each, right? So now I'm going to read you this list of risk factors and they're going to pop up on the screen. Examples of risk factors include negative attitudes, values, or beliefs, low self-esteem, drug, alcohol, or solvent abuse, poverty, children of parents in conflict with the law, homelessness, presence of neighborhood crime, early and repeated antisocial behavior, lack of positive role models, children who witness violence, lack of services, social, recreational, cultural, etc., unemployment or underemployment, family distress, racism, mental or physical illness, low literacy, leaving institutional or governmental care, so that's the hospital, foster care, correctional facilities, family violence. Okay, so we have a really long list there for both of those. There were some that were just the positive or neutral opposite of the other, right? So we have, positive attitudes, values, or beliefs versus negative attitudes, values, and beliefs. So there we have the inverse positive or the inverse negative. Some of them we don't, right? So we have in a risk factor, we have racism versus in the protective factors, we don't have this sort of like pluralism. It's not prescriptive. It's not saying that if you experience any one of these things, then you are going to develop mental illness. It's not saying that you are going to partake in a crime or that you're going to be victimized yourself. And it's not saying that if you're poor, then you're going to have poor well-being, right? It's not saying those things. But what it is saying is that these are giving us a picture of a person in a context and saying that when we have stable housing and we have stable employment, then we don't have to worry about basic needs, right? So worrying about basic needs causes significant distress or stress on someone, right? That's an example of a risk factor or a few risk factors that might be taken into account. Now, in the field of psychology, psychotherapists, whenever they are meeting with a client, typically this always happens in the beginning, they create something called a biopsychosocial assessment. What is a biopsychosocial assessment? This is an assessment that takes, like I mentioned before, a person in their whole context. So this assessment takes all of these different factors, right? And it attempts to create an assessment that addresses all of these things that are going on, not, for example, just biological happenings, biological occurrences. So we get that in the title, biopsychosocial assessment. So we are taking that into consideration, right? Are there biological things that are happening that are playing a role, contributing to a person's, maybe the presence of symptoms or mental health, mental illness? But it's not just that, right? Because in the field of psychology, we understand that a person may be experiencing symptoms that are related to biological happenings, but we are people within a specific context, and this is an attempt to address all of those contributing factors on our mental health. I want to give you just a little bit of an example of how this might play out. So one example of this could be if somebody is experiencing depressive symptoms. Okay, so they have low mood, they are dreading work, they lack motivation, they have decreased interest in activities that they used to enjoy, they lack energy, they may be oversleeping or undersleeping, and they may just feel like a sense of purposelessness. So as a therapist, right, somebody might come to me, they might list these symptoms, they might tell me, I'm having these things that are happening. And I can say like, well, sort of you're starting to check the boxes there for depression on the spectrum of the diagnosis. But they might tell me, I might ask some more questions. They might tell me they've been experiencing this for about 6 months. I'm like, okay, still got the DSM here, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And that's what everybody uses for diagnoses, if you're wondering. So I've got my DSM here, and I might be going, all right, 6 months or longer, like still checking this off. But then, they might tell me about, they told me that they're dreading work. So they might tell me about how their company recently went through a merger. And because of this merger, the leadership of their company changed. Now, since then, they have more responsibility, less recognition for all of the effort that they're putting in, a higher workload, and their boss isn't sympathetic. So fast forward, they found a new job with a supportive boss, a good work-life balance, and they experience a drop in depressive symptoms. You might say, well, clearly that makes sense, right? If I was only looking at biological happenings, that wouldn't be the primary focus of treatment, would be addressing the stress that the job is causing. But when I take a person as a whole person in a specific context, I'm able to target these specific things. So like we're going to address the symptoms of maybe not interested anymore in things that they used to like, not seeing friends, or like trouble sleeping. So sure, we're going to address those things, but we're also going to really try to target that root. And it seems like the root here, for this example that I gave you, is this jobs change that's happened, and it's really impacting their day-to-day life. Because we are people in context, we don't live in a bubble. Now, back to religion. Religion does check the box for many of the protective factors that we listed. There has been significant research that has been done on the impact of religion on suicidality, substance use disorders, adolescence. The list goes on. The literature is really quite large, and that's why it's generally considered a protective factor. But what we also know about religion through many of our own lived experiences is that there are some negative outcomes of religion. Two of those negative outcomes are social isolation and discrimination. So social isolation and discrimination often go hand in hand. Depending on how religious beliefs are held, someone may discriminate against another person for not adhering to the same beliefs system that they do, or for having the same belief practices that they have. When this happens, the person is often ostracized from the group, which increases isolation and negative outcomes. So some of those risk factors that we talked about, like maybe low self-esteem or not having positive adult role models or mentors. So it can, when that discrimination occurs, it can increase the presence of those other things. Another aspect of isolation and discrimination is in-group and out-group tendencies. When there is a dominant group and a minority group, there is a tendency for the dominant group to discriminate against the minority group. So if you're an adolescent and you attend a private school and there's somebody who goes to your school who isn't the same practicing religion as the private school, or the sort of like religious education that you're receiving, or is non-religious, right? That this person might be discriminated against because they don't adhere to the dominant group. There are so many examples of how this plays out that each one of us probably has examples on the tip of our tongue of how this happens or how you've seen it happen. LGBTQ persons, divorced, premarital sex, having children outside of marriage, marrying a person of different or no faith, alcohol consumption, substance use, and even expressing doubt, right? So these are all things that religions tend to talk about, advise on. And so if your religion advises on a specific diet and you don't keep that diet for whatever reason, right? Like these are all things that can increase the likelihood of that in-group, out-group, so discrimination, and then subsequently that isolation, right? And those are those negative outcomes, those risk factors associated with religion. And then I add doubt. I don't know if you caught that, but I added doubt in there at the very end because oftentimes in religious communities, I know this for myself, when we express doubt, you're often shushed. That is, we're sort of, we'll talk about that. How about we talk about that after class? Or, right, we're like, why don't we go in the hallway and talk about that? So we're shushed because doubt is a threat. We talked about this in a previous episode. And doubt is one of those sneaky circumstances that we may not think of right away as antithetical or causing tension in religious communities, but it's not a negative outcome, but it can lead to negative outcomes or to those isolation, discrimination, because when we're expressing doubt or concern about whatever is happening, that is seen as a threat. That's seen as, and in religious communities, there's often not that sort of openness to other ways of, sort of being, thinking, etc. Because the rituals and the beliefs in that religious community are seen as the things that have to be protected, right? And when there's something that's going against that, then that turns into the threat, right? Okay, so we'll go into that more over time, but I wanted to just kind of give an intro today into, I've talked to you a lot about positive aspects of religion because there are many, but it's also really important for us to address some of these negatives that happen, and even often, unfortunately, in religious communities. If you are experiencing isolation or discrimination due to religion, or if you're having any of these negative experiences that we are talking about, I encourage you to consider reaching out for help. Usually, I mention at the end to contact your local clergy. but it is important to note that this may not be a safe or comfortable thing or a welcomed thing to talk to them about. So I do recommend that you contact a local therapist if you would like some professional support as you think through some of these things, or a trusted friend who is willing to sort through some of this with you and find the best way forward. If you are a Massachusetts resident and you would like to schedule an initial consult for one-on-one therapy in my private practice, you are welcome to go to the description to find a link to make that appointment. Friends, sending you well wishes on your journey. Be well.